Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the government and legal correspondent. Today, my guest is Supreme Court candidate Judge Susan Crawford. Judge, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jamie.
Let's start with, you've been introduced to some of the voters, anybody who has a television and watches commercials. Those ads started quite early in the campaign season, considering officially you didn't turn in nomination papers until around the first of the year. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
All right. So let's back up and tell the voters a little bit about your background, where you live, where you grew up, how long you've been a judge.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamie. So I grew up in Chippewa Falls, so, not too far away in Western Wisconsin. I was one of four kids. I had a great childhood there in Chippewa Falls. It's a great community where people, I think, really watch out for each other and care for each other. Those were important values in my family. I went to college at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. Later, obviously went to law school. I went to law school at the University of Iowa. Practiced for a couple of years in Iowa, but I really wanted to get back to my home state of Wisconsin. So I was fortunate to land a job at the Wisconsin Department of Justice as an assistant attorney general, and moved to Madison in the late 90s with my now husband. We've raised our two kids in Wisconsin, in Madison, and I've had a great career there, starting out as a prosecutor at the Wisconsin Department of Justice, handling criminal cases all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Later, I was in private practice for several years, standing up for Wisconsinites and protecting their rights in our courts, including things like reproductive health care rights, voting rights, the rights of workers, and became a judge in 2018, and I've been on the bench ever since then.
And were you appointed to the bench and then stood for election?
Nope, I ran a contested race in 2018, which was successful, and was just reelected last spring to my circuit court seat in an uncontested race.
So we're coming up on 7 years that you have been a judge then.
That's
Okay,
right.
and what years were you at the Attorney General?
I was there, so I began in 1997, and I was there until early in 2003. So the Attorney General at that time, for that whole period of time, was Jim Doyle. He was elected governor, and when he was elected governor, he offered to have me join his administration, and I actually served a number of different appointments in his administration, ultimately as chief legal counsel in the governor's office. But working hard throughout the 8 years that he was in office to protect the rights of Wisconsinites under our laws and make sure our laws were applied and enforced fairly and equally.
Okay. So your assignment, you had said that you handle different types of cases at the Attorney General's office. So was that prosecuting?
Yes.
Or mostly appeals?
Yeah, so I was a prosecutor, both in the circuit courts around the state doing healthcare fraud and patient abuse cases, and criminal appeals. So that was felony cases that I took all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court when necessary. I was promoted to be the director of criminal appeals at the Department of Justice. So in that role, I had broad responsibility for making sure that the state of Wisconsin was basically speaking with one uniform voice as it prosecuted cases in the appellate courts. That's really important because those decisions from the Court of Appeals and the Wisconsin Supreme Court establish precedent that has to be followed in all of the state courts all around the state. So consistency and the uniformity of the state's positions is something that we really had to work at and assure. And
So,
yeah, go ahead.
well, so you have trial court experience both as a prosecutor and as a judge.
Yes.
And then you've got appellate experience as an attorney.
Right.
So let's just briefly talk about your time as a judge, and that, why did you leave being an advocate, in a private practice and so forth, to then wanting to be on the bench?
Well, I was in private practice for about 7.5 years, and it's work I'm really proud of because I was fighting for the fundamental rights of Wisconsinites in, courtrooms around the state. And often those cases would get, and so these are civil cases, they involve civil rights, constitutional issues, issues of broad public interest. And often they would end up in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And at that time, the Wisconsin Supreme Court had a very conservative, very far right majority that I believed seemed more interested in rubber stamping a Republican agenda at that time, the agenda of the Walker administration. So in other words, we'd win protections for our clients in the circuit courts and then see them overturned in the Supreme Court time after time. So I decided I wanted to, try something else, get at justice from a different angle. And I decided that being a judge would be a more effective use of my experience and skills and a way for me to, again, just protect the rights of Wisconsinites under our laws.
And then as a judge in Dane County, did you have opportunity to participate in cases that ended up going to the Supreme Court, being reviewed at that level?
Yes, a few, it's interesting because appeals don't happen all that frequently. Um, uh, you probably know yourself, Jamie, that the vast majority of cases are settled, don't go to trial, but those that go to trial, a certain percentage of them do end up in the appellate courts. I have not had case yet as a circuit court judge actually be decided by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I've had a few that have been through the Court of Appeals, and then, the party that did not prevail tried to get the Supreme Court to take it up, but so far there have not been any that have been decided.
Right. I think the average person doesn't realize how few cases the Supreme Court takes compared to all the cases that are appealed. The
Right.
Court of Appeals doesn't have that ability to decline to review cases. They review them all, and sometimes they're affirming quite a bit of the time. But getting to the Supreme Court, it's a very low percentage of cases. So then I have to ask, why the Supreme Court? You were basically reelected as a judge, and then
Right.
the campaign seemed to start like the next day for a Supreme Court.
Just about. So yeah, I was reelected in April. And then soon after that, Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, who is the most senior justice on the Supreme Court and whose seat I am now running for, announced that she was not going to run again. And she had earlier said that she thought she would run again, but she ultimately decided to retire. And as soon as I heard that, I was very interested and felt that it was an opportunity for me to continue to use the experience that I've gained over many years and in a wide variety of different contexts in the law to really have a statewide impact on protecting the rights of Wisconsinites under our laws and Constitution. So it didn't take long for me to decide that I wanted to run for this seat.
Okay, well, you're attempting to fill the shoes of a longtime jurist. I remember when Judge Walsh Bradley, or Justice Walsh Bradley, was a judge up in Marathon County, and I worked in the late 80s there on the Court of Appeals in Wausau.
Yeah.
So anyway, she's got quite the legacy. And
oh, she does. Yeah. I argued for the first time in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court back in 1998. It was in a criminal case, and she was on the Supreme Court at that time, along with Chief Justice Shirley Abrahamson, and they both are such inspiration for me and role models as how to be a good justice on the Supreme Court. They're both.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about then how Susan Crawford's approach would be to the judiciary. What would be your judicial philosophy? And then we can talk about some of the things that have come up in the campaign. But just basically, how do you approach your job, whether it's as trial court judge or then, in this case, reviewing cases that get all the way to the Supreme Court?
Right. Well, I think what I center my decision-making on is the people in my courtroom. I think it is really an important, it's important to center the people and the problem that they're trying to get resolved in your court. So I apply common sense. Obviously, I make sure that I'm applying the law, correctly and impartially. I also really focus on making sure that I get the facts right based on the evidence that's presented in court, and ultimately try to make a common sense decision that resolves the dispute for the parties and protects their rights under the laws and Constitution. I fundamentally believe that our laws and Constitution exist to protect people, to protect their rights. And that's, I always try to apply them in a way that serves that purpose. And that's pretty much what I would do on the Wisconsin Supreme Court as well. And I do think that there's another important dimension to, having handled literally hundreds of cases, both criminal cases and civil cases in the appellate courts. It is important to consider that the decisions in those cases are going to establish statewide precedent in many instances, and to consider how the principles or the legal rulings you're advocating for when I was an attorney would be applied in future cases. Certainly the justices on the Wisconsin Supreme Court need to be considering that. So that's something that I will definitely focus on is, if I'm making a decision, how is that going to play out in future cases, in different factual contexts in which it might be applied across the state of Wisconsin. And then another change from serving on the circuit court to the Supreme Court is that, in the circuit court, I am the judge in my courtroom, and my decisions are it for those parties, unless they seek an appeal, which typically they don't, as we just said. On the Wisconsin Supreme Court, that court is a body of 7 justices. So I do think it's really important for the justices to share each other's perspectives and to understand when there's disagreement, what the reasoning is of the other justices, and to hear them out. And I will really strive to keep an open mind until I have heard the entire case and heard what my colleagues on the court have to say and how they see the issues before I make a final decision.
Well, if folks believe all the negative ads that they see on TV, you and your opponent have already, decided all the cases that are going to be before you, and, stated where you stand on all the issues. Now, do you feel that some of those accusations are fair?
Well, with respect to my views, my opponent, Brad Schimmel, is speculating when he says how I would decide certain issues. I have been, very careful not to say how I would decide any particular case or any case that might end up before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I think it's very important, as I just said, to keep an open mind and to make decisions not based on, what you see in a newspaper headline, but based on, all of the evidence in the case, the attorney's arguments, my own research on the law, and as I said, on the Supreme Court, the perspectives of my colleagues. And so I have been very careful not to state how I would decide any case. That is in contrast to my opponent. He has said, for example, that he believes an 1849 abortion law, which is before the Wisconsin Supreme Court to decide whether that law remains valid or not. He said he thinks it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. He's prejudging that case, and that's prejudicial to the parties in that case. And I don't believe that he has heard the parties' arguments or read the briefs or seen what kind of evidence they presented in court in support of their positions. He's done the same thing with a case involving a provision of Act 10 that's working its way through the courts. A circuit court judge in Dane County, one of my colleagues, found that provision to be unconstitutional, and Schimmel's campaign immediately issued a press release condemning it. And again, I think based on headlines and not based on the facts or the evidence or the legal arguments in that case. So I won't do that. I have not done that. And when my opponent says otherwise, he is lying to the public. He is making things up. He is speculating and often taking positions that I took as a lawyer, which as a lawyer yourself, Jamie, are positions and arguments I was making as an advocate for my clients, not necessarily my personal opinions on things.
Yes, yeah. As a profession, you have to separate your personal opinions from your work. And one of the things that the public has seen, it's primarily, I think, the impetus was Citizens United, and that's a U.S. Supreme Court case that basically said outside groups can spend whatever they want to spend, primarily corporations, rather than individuals who do have limits on what they can give, for example, your campaign or your opponent's campaign. But these independent corporations can spend whatever they want. And we've seen that then since roughly 2007, whenever Louis Butler was trying to run for re-election or election, he was defeated by independent ads. And it's only gotten more and more partisan with those ads. So what do you see that having the impact on your race here?
Yeah, well, we are certainly seeing that have an impact on this race. Most notably, Elon Musk, who has, as you know, unlimited money. He's the richest man in the world, has spent, as of today, I think it's $8 million, not just on these false and like really terrible advertisements that you're seeing on TV, but also he's paying canvassers to go out door to door and to hand out flyers that say things like, we need to protect the Trump agenda by putting Brad Schimmel on the Supreme Court. So it's a very partisan message, just nakedly trying to pursue politics through the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I do think that should not happen in a nonpartisan Supreme Court race like we have here. But there's obviously no stopping Elon Musk. He is trying to buy a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And unfortunately, my opponent, Brad Schimmel, seems to welcome it. He said recently that he wants to be part of Trump's support network on the Supreme Court. That's showing clear bias and partisanship. We need our Supreme Court to be independent and to work for the people of Wisconsin, not work for a partisan agenda, and certainly not work for Elon Musk.
Well, I have seen those ads where they're trying to tie the outcome of this Supreme Court race, your Supreme Court race, to the Trump agenda. But they're skipping the fact that the Trump agenda is a federal agenda and one that federal courts and judiciary, and now they've lamented the role of the judiciary. They want to see judges not as strong as the executive and so forth. So how do you see the impact of the Wisconsin Supreme Court when it comes to overall federal policy, federal agenda, whether it's Trump's or Elon Musk?
Right. Well, as you just said, for the most part, the case, and we've seen dozens of lawsuits now filed against some of President Trump's executive orders and these early decisions. And that's the appropriate place for them, is in federal court, because of, the differences between federal law and state law and federal courts and state courts. But I think it is likely that we may see spillover into state policy and law and state courts related to some of the president's policy objectives. I don't want to get too deep into that question, Jamie, because it's really up to lawyers and their clients to bring appropriate lawsuits to the courts. The courts don't define, they don't go out looking for cases or deciding what issues should be brought to them. It's up to lawyers and their clients.
And I respect that.
Have a valid claim.
Yeah, again, I respect your wishes to not want to get into specific cases, but one of the connections, and I don't know, it seems a bit tenuous to me, is this idea of the fair maps, which under Wisconsin Constitution, clearly judiciary does have a role to determine those voting districts and what is fair. Certainly, one party can be dominating the either or both of the houses and end up drawing up the maps that would favor them, but ultimately it still needs to be a judiciary to determine whether or not the way it was drawn was fair. Now, they've already determined that you're going to stack the deck, so to speak, against the Trump, but our next census is not till 2030. So,
Right.
you know, explain to me how that would be the case, and you know, what would be your response to that notion that you've pre-decided these maps that haven't even been drawn based on a census that hasn't even taken place yet?
Right. Well, that's a great question, Jamie, and it is one that I don't have any answers for because I don't know what kind of legal challenges might be raised to future maps. I also don't know what kind of legal challenges might be raised to the current maps for that matter. And I don't know if the, I don't know if my opponent or Elon Musk or, I don't know what their theory is on that, but I have never, ever taken a position or commented either publicly or privately for that matter on the validity of the current congressional maps. It's just not something that I have paid that much attention to be honest, or looked at closely. So it's a lot of speculation on their part.
All right. Now, you had mentioned about Elon Musk and the $8 million plus that he's spending either directly into the Schimmel campaign or by paying staffers and so forth. But there's been allegations that George Soros is doing similar with regard to yours. Now, is that connection as direct?
No. Well, it is not direct. And what they're talking about is there have been a couple of individuals who have made very generous contributions to the whoops, we just lost a sign in the background, to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. And the Democratic Party of Wisconsin has contributed generously to my campaign. But those contributions are dwarfed by the amount of money, this sheer volume of money that Elon Musk is spending on this race for my opponent, Brad Schimmel. It's just orders of magnitude different. And so when you hear people making those comparisons, it's a false equivalency. It just cannot compare.
All right. I will just throw it out there then. Is there any issue that we haven't touched upon, Judge, that you would like to emphasize for our watching public?
Well, I would just like to point out some things about my opponent, Brad Schimmel's record that I think voters should be paying really close attention to and considering as they decide at the ballot box who to vote for in this election. Brad Schimmel was a Republican Attorney General in Wisconsin for a 4-year term. And during that 4-year term, there was a huge backlog of sexual assault kits, over 6,000 kits awaiting DNA testing that he just decided not to prioritize. And instead, he was prioritizing things like trying to overturn federal law protections that prevent health insurance companies from dumping people who have pre-existing health conditions, from dumping young people from their parents' insurance policies, and protections that allow women's contraceptive services to be covered. And he was pursuing a right-wing legal agenda instead of minding the most critical public safety issues in Wisconsin, including getting those sexual assault kits tested, dealing with things like the opioid epidemic at that time. At that time, it was the main problem was OxyContin and other opioid-based pills. And most of the other states in the country had joined a national lawsuit to try to hold those manufacturers of those medications accountable because they were flooding our communities with addictive drugs that destroyed a lot of families and a lot of individual lives in Wisconsin. And Brad Schimmel refused to get into that lawsuit. At that time, he was taking thousands of dollars of campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies. So, he does have a history of being bought off essentially, and of making political choices that failed to protect our community and prioritized right-wing causes instead of the safety of women and children and the communities in Wisconsin. So again, I have a history of being a prosecutor and a judge who has always put community safety first, and that's what I'll do in the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Very good. Are there any plans for you to get up close to your home county of
Oh, yeah.
Chippewa?
Yep, we are set to do a lot of travel in the next couple of weeks, and I will for sure be in Chippewa Falls and possibly in further west in western Wisconsin as well.
Very good. Well, thank you, Judge Crawford, for being a guest on our show. I want to thank our viewers for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. Keep watching.